Hey readers! I'm Olivia.
And I'm Hannah Ray.
And we are so excited to be creating content for the Starkville Reads campaign. And today we are going to be talking about The Fall of the House of Usher and the series Atlanta, specifically the episode Teddy Perkins. So to quickly give some context, this episode aired in 2018, while The Fall of the House of Usher was written by Edgar Allan Poe almost 200 years before in 1839. And so to start out with the episode of Atlanta, immediately we get these ominous, eerie vibes. It very heavily deals with the idea of the grotesque, and it's just deeply unsettling. Like, if you've seen this episode, you know, like, you see the house and you see Teddy Perkins, and it's just all very weird and all very unsettling.
Yeah, absolutely. In particular, I'm thinking of the moments when Teddy Perkins opens the door and it kind of comes out of nowhere, and Darius is really caught off guard. And then also the scene where he starts digging in this, like, goose egg. I think is it a goose egg?
Yeah, it's a goose egg.
And
it's an ostrich egg.
An ostrich egg. Excuse me. Crazy. It's really turns my stomach a little bit, to be honest.
Yeah, it was very weird.
But it was really creepy, and it almost seems as if the eeriness, the gloom, has no real meaning to it.
It almost feels overdone, like it feels like satirical. Almost.
Yeah, and I think that's why it's such a popular episode of, like, it's so creepy. Mm-hmm. But actually, if we look into the Southern Gothic tradition, and if we look into Edgar Allan Poe's The Fall of the House of Usher, we see that this episode actually almost directly reflects the fall of the House of Usher, which is basically like the canon, if you will, of Southern Gothic literature.
Mm-hmm. It's like emblematic of the genre altogether.
Absolutely.
It's like what you look to, to kind of understand it. Mm-hmm. So to talk more about The Fall of the House of Usher, so it begins with this giant plantation house that you see in almost all stories of Southern Gothic literature. You've got this house that's very dark, it's very eerie, it's very tied to the past, it's this old mansion, and almost always this house is going to be a direct reflection of the person who owns it. And we see that in The Fall of the House of Usher. We have Roderick Usher, who's dying, like his house, like the house is decaying. It's very devoid of life, very dark. And that directly reflects the life and personality of Roderick Usher. Yeah. And so, if you want to talk about how it kind of, that sets the standard for Southern Gothic tradition.
So basically, if you study Southern Gothic literature, then you would know that these themes, like death and the undead and decay and grotesqueness and mystery and the plantation house, these are all over Southern Gothic pieces of literature. And this all really starts with Poe.
Yeah, I would have to agree. So to give a brief synopsis of the story, just hitting on these main Southern Gothic elements, we have the uneasy narrator who helps Roderick as he's dying. When we read in the text in the very beginning, he talks about how unsettled he is, how fearful he is. He just gets this weird, anxious feeling, which is kind of like the feeling that you get when you watch Atlanta, but we'll talk about that later. But we've got Roderick, who just has this disease, and he also has this mysterious sibling who's very elusive. We don't really see much of her, but she ends up dying. But then we get this, she's dead, but she's undead, because at the end of the story, she kind of reemerges as this weird, ghostly figure. And then she also has this tie to the past, and we see a lot of, like, the past becoming present and the past influencing the present. And yeah, that's basically all the high points of Southern Gothic in Fall of the House of Usher.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we're going to go ahead and transition and talk more about the specifics between The Fall of the House of Usher and the Atlanta episode. And I will start us out with probably the more obvious reflection of Southern Gothic tradition, and that is the house. In the episode itself, Darius is going to buy this piano, and he's taken to this really large, beautiful house. But as soon as he gets there and he walks up, it's almost like this really creepy feeling. The house is dark. There's old decor. It almost looks dusty. There just doesn't. It looks as though nobody lives there.
I was about to say, it looks unlived in.
Yes, and so that's why when he opens the door and Teddy Perkins is like, "Hi there," it's really like funny.
Yes, it's silly. It's just very odd. It's very off-putting. Like you're not expecting that.
Yeah. So, and in the same way, the House of Usher is also very devoid of life. It's very gloomy. It's dark, almost haunted. And so Donald Glover really plays off of this theme. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I'm going to talk a little bit more about that idea of like an unsettled narrator and just this feeling of anxiousness that you get when you read the piece or you watch the episode. Because I don't know if we mentioned this, but the episode is a direct adaptation of Fall of the House of Usher.
Yeah.
And so whenever we read Fall of the House of Usher, we get this piece of the narrator was just feeling really anxious and approaching, and he's like, there's something wrong, I just can't put my finger on it. And that is the exact same thing that we see with Darius. He gets to the house to pick up the piano, and he immediately calls his friends. He's like, something is off here, I don't really feel right. And that's what the author does in Fall of the House of Usher. He's writing this down, and he's telling us, the readers, it's like, something's off here, but I can't really figure out what it is. We see both of that, both this idea of just anxiety and like the fear of the unknown. We see that in both of the pieces.
Absolutely. And to continue on, there is this, speaking of the house, there is this sense of, like, entrapment by the siblings of the protagonists in each of these stories. So, in the house in Atlanta, we hear, and we get this idea that, Teddy has a sibling. We don't really know if he's dead or if he is alive, but he alludes to him being dead. But it turns out he's alive and he's trapped in the basement. At the later part of the episode, Darius goes down and actually sees Benny, and he's like in a wheelchair and completely like bound, and there's just no way of escaping. And it's in that moment that he warns Darius that Teddy wants to kill both of them. So, yeah.
And very similar, we have this strange sibling dynamic in the Fall of the House of Usher. We've got Madeline and how she kind of mirrors Benny, as Hannah Ray was just saying, but she dies. She does end up dying, but then she comes back. And so it's like she's physically dead, but she's also like alive as well near the end, and she ends up killing Roderick. And so we just get this strange like sibling dynamic of they seem very close, but then it turns very violent, which is exactly in Atlanta. We see this idea that Teddy cares very much for his brother Benny, but then he's like very violent, hostile towards him, and like wants to kill him. And that's the same with Madeline. Like her and Roderick do appear to be very close, but then she does end up taking his life.
And the relationships in both of these cases are really bizarre. And to continue to talk about these sibling relationships, we see that these are both siblings that are at the end of a family line. In particular, in the Atlanta case, Teddy and Benny both end up dying because Benny surprisingly comes out and murders Teddy, kind of in this like revenge moment. And then Benny unfortunately ends up taking his own life.
Yeah, and that's very similar to the case of Madeline and Roderick of she's killed, but then she comes back and she kills Roderick, and then we also assume that she's dead again. And so it's this idea of sibling on sibling violence. Yeah. And so that is pretty much all there is to dig into there. And so now we're going to transition into the past becoming the present. Yeah. In the Southern Gothic tradition, there is this idea of the past forming the present, and like you can't isolate the past from the present or the present from the past. They're very interconnected. And we see that a lot in both stories, but especially in Atlanta is what I want to hit on first. Of near the end of the episode when Darius is pleading for his life with Teddy, and Teddy starts talking about the way that his dad treated him. Darius is like, you don't have to do this, like, you don't have to be violent, but Teddy essentially is like, because my dad was so violent to me, like, this is why I am the way that I am, this is why I'm treating you like this. And so we get this idea of like childhood in the past, forming the ways in which that Teddy treats other people now. It's like violence perpetuates violence. And then in the same way we get that in the Fall of the House of Usher of this idea of Madeline literally like coming from the past, re-entering in the present, and how her death in the past is directly linked to her death again, and then Roderick's death in the present. Of she was this figure that even though she died in the past, she doesn't stay dead, but she reemerges and affects the present by killing Roderick.
Yeah. So I think that those are like most of the really large and most obvious relationships and connections between Fall of the House of Usher and Teddy Perkins. There are obviously other smaller details, but
these are the ways that it's going to help you if you read them isolated or if you read them together. This is just going to help your experience and understand the historical and cultural significance.
Yeah, so we hope you guys enjoyed. Thanks for listening, and
read books.
Read
Southern Gothic books.